Started. So this morning we're going to talk a little bit about industrial hemp production. Just quick show of hands, just so I know, how many people went to Andrew's talk yesterday morning? Good, a fair number of people. So sorry, but this is going to, half of this talk is the same, all right? We felt it was really important to discuss some of this information, especially the economic information, and we think that people should hear it twice and more than twice. So, but maybe we'll present it slightly differently, or maybe I'll present it slightly more entertainingly than Andrew did, and maybe you'll get it the second time around. All right, so Andrew spoke yesterday about some of the results of our partnership. So for those of you who don't know, in order to produce industrial hemp in the state of Maryland this year, growers had to partner with institutions of higher education. So that meant that you had to have a partner, so a researcher at any college or university in Maryland, and we were responsible for guiding you through the process of research and also being there to observe and assist with the final THC testing, the regulatory aspect, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, okay? So Andrew presented some of the results from our partners that we had, and I'm going to talk about some of the results of the plants that we grew at our research center, Y Research and Education Center up in Queenstown, all right? So similar, different data, but we're similar economics towards the end. So the number one question I get is, how do I know, what is the difference between industrial hemp and marijuana? They're the same exact plant, okay? Same plant. The only difference is the percentage of that THC, all right? That is the phytochemical in the plant that gets you high, all right? That is the phytochemical that is being regulated, okay? So as long as that cannabis sativa plant has less than 0.3% THC, it is considered industrial hemp. As soon as it goes over that 0.3% THC, it is considered marijuana. All right, so what does that look like? Sorry, I know chemistry, it's early. We're all still, you know, waking up from last night. I get it, but we got to go through it, okay? So, delta-9 THC. This is the phytochemical. This is the chemical in the plant that gets you high. This is what we are currently regulating. What's important is that there is a precursor to that delta-9, this THCA, okay? And we say scary words like decarboxylation. All that means is this little group in red falls off, okay? So this THCA, this precursor, when it gets heated, it will turn into the delta-9, the stuff that gets you high, okay? So this is important. I'm twisting myself all up here. This is important because this year we are concerned with delta-9. When the federal regulations change, next year we will be concerned with the sum of these two, okay? So next year we will be paying attention to that THCA, that precursor, and I'm going to show you some of this data in a little bit, okay, why this is important. Don't worry, I'll come back to this. There's no quiz. You don't have to remember exactly what this looks like. The point I want to make, though, is that the University of Maryland is only providing resources, research, and extension for industrial hemp production. So don't call us and ask us questions about marijuana, cannabis, medical, recreational. We don't do that. Our focus is solely on industrial hemp. I made a joke in the first session, but I'm being recorded this one. Don't email me with these questions, and don't trick Andrew into it either, because he's nice and he'll answer your questions, but we're really not supposed to, okay? So don't email us with questions about medical marijuana or recreational marijuana. University of Maryland only provides support for industrial hemp. I like to make that nice and clear up front. Okay, so when we talk about producing hemp, again, it's the same plant used for a lot of different purposes. And I like to think of these as two different production systems because they really are. All right, so when you are producing hemp and the end goal is to extract CBD out of that biomass, I want you to think of this as a tobacco production system or a tomato production system, all right? Rows, you know, cleaning up in between those rows. This picture doesn't have it, but we laid plastic down and drip irrigation. That's what you kind of have to wrap your brain around. Producing hemp for CBD is just like tobacco, just like tomato. That kind of specialty crop, more intensive management, all right? The management is key. You know, there are no pesticides, there are no products labeled right now for use on industrial hemp. How do you think we kept the rows clean in between our plants? Mike knows, manual labor. Yeah, exactly. All right, so keep that in mind as we're moving through. That's what we're talking about in this production system, okay? So that's for CBD, and I point this out because this is what we're going to be talking about, and this is where University of Maryland, this is where we chose to focus our efforts in this first year of growing, all right? But there's also, you know, hemp, again, same plant, different varieties, different strains that are used to produce fiber and grain. And I like to akin this more to producing hay. When I think about, you know, actual production farmers getting into growing hemp, I'm not particularly envisioning them growing CBD hemp. I'm thinking that we're going to focus a little more on this fiber and grain. And I think the longevity of the market, I think fiber and grain production is really where we're going to be moving forward with the hemp. But I point this out because I want you all to have this picture in your mind. As I'm going through my results, we only produced hemp for CBD this year, and that's what all of my data is reporting. So our question for this year, being that we live in the land of nutrient management, right? We all know this. So our kind of initial question was, what is the optimum nitrogen rate that we need to be putting on these plants? And where this differs from kind of my more agronomic background, thinking about crops like corn and soybean and wheat, and we're just thinking, how much nitrogen do we need to maximize yield, right? These crops are a little different. Not only are we concerned with yield in terms of biomass, right, because that's where we're going to extract that CBD from, we're also concerned about those phytochemicals, right? So we want to maximize our biomass. We want to make sure we can increase that CBD because that's the desirable chemical. We want CBD to be high. But we don't want that THC to go above that legal limit, right, of 0.3, because then we're growing marijuana and then we have to destroy our crop. Then you're making $0, okay? So it's a delicate balancing act of yield and these phytochemicals, all right? And so this was the research, this is what we looked at. So here's just a quick layout of what our field looked like. The important parts, we had 5 different nitrogen rates, and we used 3 different varieties, Bayox, cherry wine, and mountain mango. I will say that the mountain mango, we're kind of like, why is it named this? You know, that there's a lot of strains of hemp and marijuana that have the cherry prefix, and we're like, where'd this mountain mango come from? And we realized after we harvested and we had them drying out in the high tunnels that the mountain mango smells like mango once it dries. It was crazy. You could just, the plants just smelled like mango. It was actually kind of cool. I was fascinated by that. So this is a schematic. What I do want to point out is that we had 3 different plants kind of per rep. We knew that we were going to lose plants, all right? We did this on purpose, and we did end up losing a fair number of plants. So we had multiple plants in each rep for our nitrogen treatments from each variety. All right, so now some pictures. It's kind of crazy, like I knew that these plants were going to look like marijuana, but until they're sitting in front of you, it's just, whoa, I signed up to grow marijuana. Like that was my thought when these plants arrived. We got these plants from a grower in North Carolina. They came at the end of May. They were so tiny. I can't believe they were ever that tiny. We also purchased some plants from a local greenhouse grower, and so those were his plants on June 6th. They were a little bit ahead of ours, and we ended up using these plants for our research. There's early June, Mike working hard and getting our plastic laid and our irrigation. Now, I want to mention, and I don't mean this as a recommendation, I'm just telling you what we did, is we put all of our nitrogen down right before we laid our plastic. I don't think that that's the way to do it, but that's the way that we did it in these trials. So I'm not recommending, hey, we should put all our nitrogen down up front. Just being clear that that's what we did. So the nitrogen got put down, and then the plastic was laid right above it. And then here are our babies a week later. I can't even believe that they were ever that small based on how big they got eventually. All right, so that was June 17th. July 24th, about a month later, holy moly, they put on so much biomass. I had no concept of how quickly these plants were going to grow. They're huge. I mentioned in the last talk, we did 6-foot centers. Okay, so because we don't have any products available to control pests, to control disease, we really wanted to make sure we were maximizing airflow. So we didn't want those plants growing on top of each other and, you know, airflow wasn't able to move through and kind of keep those pests and keep those diseases at bay. So we really went definitely wide, 6-foot centers. And we had some of our partners say, nah, that's too much. We're going to go 3-foot. And I'd recommend less than 6 because you'll see those plants were already getting pretty close. By August, they were getting really close to each other and they still had a month left to go after this. And so we really recommend keeping that row spacing as wide as you can. So this was end of August. Again, these guys were getting really big. The stakes were probably about as tall as I was. They might be a little taller than I am. So that was end of August. Early September is when we switched over to flowering. We started seeing our beautiful buds developed. And as much as I just wanted to show really beautiful pictures of our plants, that's not the reality. We had some losses, so I had to show them to you. So you'll see on the left, here's one of our diseased plants. And what we started noticing was the plants would look okay, and then they'd start looking a little wilty when like none of the other plants looked wilty. And then they almost started, I was saying the plants looked like they imploded on themselves. Like they literally had no stability and just kind of fell in on themselves. And we sent some samples down to University of Maryland Plant Diagnostic Lab, and you know, Karen Rain confirmed that this was Fusarium crown rot. So that's what this poor plant was suffering from. And you'll notice that the plant right next to it, it's an empty stake with no plant, right? We had some losses. This was the reason why we put 3 plants per rep, to make sure we could at least get something that made it through the season. We lost between 5 and 10% of our plants to diseases this year. But positive note, look at that plant in the background of that picture. Man, that sucker's huge. So, you know, we had some plants that got really tall and did really well. So, just have to end on a positive note. Okay, so we had planned end of September was when we were going to harvest our plants. I was joking that it was like Christmas in September because it felt like we were going down to cut a Christmas tree, right? We had the chainsaw and we were out in the field cutting these plants down, dragging them over and hanging them up to weigh them. And so I was like, man, it's like Christmas in September. But I mean, that just gives you an idea of how big and how heavy these plants were. So we are researchers, but we are not above the federal regulations. We had to take our final leaf samples. The regulations are at least 2 weeks prior to harvest. You have to sample the youngest, most mature leaves of the plant. That's where that THC is going to accumulate. And you have to analyze those samples for THC, make sure they're below the 0.3 threshold, then you get the go-ahead to harvest. So we took those samples on September 20th. That was the day that I realized that it makes me very nauseous smelling the smell of fresh hemp. So they've got another phytochemical called terpenes that really give it that kind of classic marijuana smell, all right? And after like 8 hours out in the heat of clipping leaf samples for these final sampling, I finally like threw those clippers down and I said to Andrew, I'm done with this. I'm not messing with these crops you can't harvest with a combine anymore because this is crazy. So after 8 hours of feeling nauseous, I finally realized it was the smell of the terpenes, and some people it does not agree with them. So that was me. So I didn't take any pictures that day. Sorry, there's no pictures of me looking miserable when we were cutting those plants apart. So we harvested these plants on September 25th, and we collected these fresh weights. They had to be dried. We filled up 3 high tunnels at the Y Research and Education Center of our plants. We only grew 1/4 of an acre. 1/4 of an acre. Okay, some of our growers had, you know, acres, 1, 2, 3 acres. And we were thinking, where are you going to dry this? Because as we started cutting down the plants and we were thinking, well, where are we going to dry these plants? We got them grown and we thought, wow, do we have enough space to even dry these plants? So 1/4 acre filled up 3 high tunnels to dry these plants. And I will say that we're not even finished cutting all these plants apart yet. So we harvested September 25th and we're still not finished. That's 1/4 acre, 1/4 acre, all right? All right, so let's look at some of the data. We're gonna look at, we're gonna start off first with these fresh weights. So we were interested in, do these different varieties have different amounts of kind of fresh weight as soon as we harvested those plants and hung them? And we noticed that Bay Ox variety did have a greater fresh weight than those other 2, which we could kind of see. By the end of the season, you could kind of pick out which plants were the Bay Ox. They were just a little larger. So, you know, useful information. What we were really after is, okay, where's that optimal nitrogen weight going to be? And again, this is just fresh weight, all right? Where do we kind of maximize that, that biomass, that fresh weight with our nitrogen treatments? And I will say that the way we designed this experiment was purposeful. We in no way anticipated that 250 pounds of nitrogen was going to be the recommendation. We just wanted to add in a couple extra extremely high nitrogen rates because we're hoping to see that plateau, which we kind of got. And Andrew and I had anticipated somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds of nitrogen was going to be the recommendation, and that's kind of basically where it fell out. So please don't take away that I thought we were going to have to put 250 pounds of nitrogen on these plants. That was not our goal. So we definitely think somewhere between 100 and 150. All right, so that was just the fresh weight. So that didn't take so long. It took us most of a day to get those fresh plants harvested and hung up. And then after those plants dried down, we were interested, okay, let's cut these plants apart and see you know, where we're seeing differences in weight. Is it stem? Is it that leafy material, that biomass? Because that's the good stuff, right? The biomass is where that CBD is going to accumulate. And so that was kind of our plan going through the season. And as we talked with some of our partners, our partnering growers, we realized that there was this kind of emerging market for selling what they've been calling colas, these like terminal flowers, these pretty looking buds, right? And there's a market for selling them as smokable hemp. So it's not marijuana, you're not going to get high, but it's just another way to take in that CBD. And so just anecdotal from some of our growers, upwards of $500 per pound of these colas, all right? And you can get about 1/2 to 1 pound per plant, again, depending on how big those plants are. So we decided to cut our plants up in the same way that our growers were. So we decided to separate out these colas, these terminal flowers, and our biomass and our stem. Yes, sir? There is going to be THC, but in theory, if it's above 0.3, you're going to have to destroy your crop anyway, right? Based on that final testing. Yeah.
Who does the testing?
So these samples have to be sent to, we are still working on clarification of what certification the labs need to have. They are being told they have to have a DEA certification, but I'm not sure that any labs actually have that certification. And so we're going with reputable labs who are using standard practices for this kind of extraction. I know we've got at least one private lab in Cambridge, Maryland, at least. University of Maryland is not doing testing, and Maryland Department of Agriculture is not doing it either. Some states, their State Department of Agriculture is doing the testing for growers. So that was a good question. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to show a little bit of data that we have from these kind of separate parts of the plant. So this is our cherry wine variety. So I mentioned we're still not finished separating these plants. We started with our cherry wine variety. We took all of our cherry wine plants, separated them out, weighed them. Then we moved on to our Bay Ox. I'm going to show you those next. And I don't even know that we've started our mountain mango yet. So huge time consumption, like a lot of time and a lot of labor going into this. So these are those colas, those terminal buds, and this is just for our cherry wine variety. Again, we just started with those plants. There's our 5 nitrogen rates down on the bottom, and this is just the weight of those colas. So to me, nothing super exciting here. We're not seeing a very clear trend as we increase our nitrogen rate. And what's also important are those error bars. They're huge. We got a lot of variability, you know, and I'm attributing some of this to human error. You know, there's 8 different people cutting these plants apart, deciding what they think is a nice looking bud or what I think is a nice looking bud. So I think a lot of this variability is coming from just humans having to make decisions, all right, human error. All right, so this is that cherry wine. Again, I've now changed these bars so that the sum of those stacked bars equals the total plant weight. And the different colors represent the different parts of the plant. So the biomass is green, the yellow, it kind of looks like pukey yellow, is stem, and then the blue are those colas, those terminal buds. Again, nothing too exciting. We're not seeing a very clear trend. I don't know what's happening with that 150 treatment there. It seems odd to me that that one would be lower. But in general, we're seeing, again, a lot of variability. We're not really seeing any major significant differences here. So interesting to note. And again, this is just for that cherry wine variety. So last time Andrew and I presented this data was Halloween, and we hadn't finished cutting apart the Bayox plants yet. So we just got this data. I think he finished weighing them on like Friday. So we were scrambling this weekend trying to put our slides together. So every time I give this talk, it's just new slides popping in as we get more data. So this is for that Bayox. Nothing too exciting. We had a little less variability, and it's probably because I stopped going out and cutting these plants apart because I was not very good at it. So I think me not being there decreased that variability. I'm going to go with that. But again, this is the total plant weight. The green is that biomass. The yellow is the stem. And then the blue is the cola. So this variety seemed to, I would say, produce a little more weight in those colas. So could potentially be a little more valuable there. But that's just kind of anecdotal. That's just me noticing that. Okay, so what did we get out of this? There's a lot of variability in our plant growth within variety, across different nitrogen treatments. Again, we're not making any major recommendations yet. We're going to repeat this next year. Just based on our first year, what we anticipated, about 100 to 125 pounds, or 120 to 125 pounds of nitrogen is probably going to be sufficient for growing this crop. And again, I mentioned that we put all of our nitrogen out up front. We had some concerns. We were monitoring plant tissue nitrogen throughout the season, and we had some concerns that, you know, our plants got a little nitrogen deficient by the end of the season. We know that their status, their nutrient needs are going to change later in the season. Again, that was just the way we put out our nitrogen. But moving forward, our general recommendation is likely for growers will be to apply some nitrogen at planting up front and then come back and supplement with drip irrigation later if possible. Okay, so that was just the weights. We also, as I mentioned, had to sample our plants for those phytochemicals. We had to do the final sample 2 weeks prior to harvest. But as we were talking to our growers throughout the season, they said, well, how are we supposed to know when to harvest this crop? You know, it's not like corn where you can kind of look at it, you go out, you test moisture, okay, it's ready to go. The plant just looks the same. The only thing that's changing is the buildup of these phytochemicals, the THC and the CBD. So how do we know when it's time to harvest? And our response was, well, you really need to be monitoring these phytochemicals as the growing season goes on. So since we were recommending that to our growers, we had to do the same thing, right? We had to play along. And so starting in July, we started collecting, again, those youngest, most mature leaves where the phytochemicals are going to accumulate. Starting in July, we started sending those to the lab to be analyzed for both THC and CBD. Okay, So this is our first variety. This is that Bayox variety. So the different color bars represent our nitrogen treatments. We did our low, middle, and our high. These samples are quite expensive, and we had limited resources provided to us from the college, so we had to make some sacrifices, and we really wanted to make sure we had enough money to sample throughout the season. So we minimized how many of our treatments we were sampling during the season, because we really wanted to make sure we could get a clear picture of what was happening in the growing season and beyond. I don't know if anyone noticed, but I told you that I harvested our plants on September 25th, yet I'm showing you a sampling time from October. Kudos to anyone who noticed that. So what we actually did the day we sampled was we purposefully left some plants out in the field. We didn't harvest all of our plants, we harvested most of them, because we were interested, what happens to these phytochemicals the longer we leave the plants out, okay? We had no intentions of selling this material. We're going to destroy it all anyway. So if it popped over the THC limit, if you know, we were growing marijuana, we were just going to destroy it anyway. You know, we're doing this for research purposes. So what happens to these phytochemicals when we leave those plants out well beyond prime harvest, all right? So we were curious. So that's why we have a final date of October 19th. Those were our last few plants that we left out there. So let's take a look at Bayox. I think generally this is probably our best performing variety in terms of CBD. So we see that nice trend of what we were expecting as the season goes on. We see an increase in CBD. That CBD percent is what we're looking at on the y-axis. Again, we want this to be high, okay? This is how you get paid. So Bayox, as we entered into October, was about 15 average, 15 to 18% CBD. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. All right. Next we have our cherry wine variety. Again, that same trend. As we go through the season, we're seeing an increase in CBD. That's what we want. We're maxing out maybe about 10%. Okay. In October, 10%. Again, different variety. They all have different buildup of these phytochemicals. And then finally our Mango Mountain. So everyone says, well, this is kind of a dud. I actually think we had higher expectations for Mango Mountain based on what we heard. But looking at this graph, you're like, well, it kind of peaked out at like 8% CBD. Maybe this isn't a great variety, but I challenge you to hold off on making a judgment on Mountain Mango yet, okay? All right, so I told you this was going to come back, the chemistry. I'm sorry, it's back, but I wanted to remind everyone before we get into this. So I just showed you the good stuff, the CBD data, right? We want that to be high, looks good, we got pretty high as we went, as the season went on. But we also have to be paying attention to the THC. So again, the delta-9 THC is what we are currently being regulated on, all right? This is the phytochemical, the delta-9 that gets you high. But again, there is that precursor, the THCA, that when it is heated, it becomes delta-9 THC. So next year, federally, someone asked me after the last session, so I will say this is not just Maryland, this is federally. Next year, we will be looking at the sum of both of these. So the phytochemical that gets you high and the precursor to it, all right? So I've split up my graphs, my next few graphs, to demonstrate this to you, all right? We're going to see the delta-9 and we're also going to see the precursor. All right, so the not fun stuff. Let's look at the THC. So now we have that potency, that sum of the delta-9 THC, which are those hashed bars, and then the solid bars are that precursor, the THCA. So this year, we were good, all right? This year, our hashed bars, everything stayed well below that 0.3%. Next year, not so good, all right? Next year, all of our nitrogen treatments for our Bayox, our top performer, had that really high CBD percent, but next year, nitrogen didn't matter. You were still going over that legal limit of your delta-9 and your precursor, okay? What do y'all think about our other varieties? Same? Different? Same? All right, let's look at cherry wine. This was our second variety. It was a decent producer, had good amount of CBD, but again, you see that we were fine with our Delta 9, those hashed bars, but when we add the Delta 9 and the precursor together, next year, we'd be over the legal limit for THC for all of these. All right, I told you to hold off your judgment on Mountain Mango. All right, this is why. We initially looked at this slide, Mountain Mango, or we initially looked at that CBD content and we're kind of disappointed. Mountain Mango was supposed to be our best performer. All right, and I looked at this initially and I said, well, there's not even any differences across the nitrogen treatment. What a dud. And then I had to remove my emotions a little bit and say, what is this graph telling me, right? So the way I interpret this is Mountain Mango actually may be a decent variety in the sense that I have less concerns about this variety going over that 0.3% limit. Obviously with our Delta 9 we were fine, but when we add the Delta 9 and the precursor together, this variety got us the closest to that legal limit. So that's why I say hold off your judgment. Mountain Mango may not have a lot of biomass and it may not even produce a huge amount of CBD, but if you're concerned about having to destroy your crop, which everybody should be, this may be one variety that, you know, if you're not a great grower, if you're a brand new grower and you're concerned about it, this may be a stable variety that you would consider. I'm not making any recommendations, I'm just interpreting the data that we see. Okay, so this one might be a good variety that, if treated the right way, could stay below that 0.3 limit for the Delta 9 and the precursor. All right, am I doing on time? Okay, good. All right, so by October 19th, our CBD was looking good, was pretty high. We were at 10 to 18%. Our Delta 9, nice and low, we weren't concerned about that. But our THC potency, the sum of the Delta 9 and that precursor, pretty much across the board, we were over that legal limit, okay? All right, that was depressing. So we'll move on from that for a short time, go back to some more pictures, because everybody loves pictures. I want to talk a little bit about some of the anecdotal evidence that we found in terms of disease, insects, and we're going to talk a little bit about money at the end, because that's what everyone's concerned about. So we started giving these hemp talks earlier in the year, maybe January, February, and I was a little nervous about talking about a crop that I'd never seen or never grown before, and really there was not a lot of data out there on it. But nonetheless, people wanted to hear about growing hemp. So Andrew and I put this slide together of every pest that we thought we might potentially see this year, right? So that we were covering our butts, so that if somebody saw something, they didn't come back and say, you didn't tell us that we should have known that there was going to be gray mold. So, so this slide, all of these were black when I gave this talk in January, and now 11 months later, we were actually able to highlight the ones that we did see. So that was exciting. I'm going to focus on those a little bit. I kind of was unsure if we were going to get deer damage. We planted these plants in a fenced-in area that kept deer out anyway because we wanted to protect our investment. But we had another set of plots that were not behind a deer fence. The other ones were behind a deer fence too, Mike? Yeah. They both had, yeah. So we weren't sure if there was going to be deer pressure, but we wanted to protect our investment anyway. But we did end up seeing a number of these pests that not only just us at the Y Research and Education Center, but some of this we got from some of our partner growers. So we got this vascular fusarium, and we really thought that it was due to the condition of our plants when they arrived. So this was our baby plants the day they got there from North Carolina. And so I'm an agronomist, not anyone who works with horticulture crops. So this has been a very new learning experience. And you know, Andrew and I talked about this, and he said, I do not understand why those growers would have ripped those young leaves off and created this open wound in this plant, making it vulnerable to some kind of an infection. All right, and so this happened with our plants. You know, the lower leaves started getting a little yellow. The nitrogen got reallocated to the more important parts of the plant. And one of the audience members from the last talk came up to me and he said, "Well, they probably were concerned that they couldn't ship those plants to you with those yellow leaves at the bottom, so they just ripped them right off." And what they did was create this big open wound, and you know, that later led to infections in these plants. And I don't think we were the only ones who saw that. I mentioned the fusarium crown rot before, so this was right at the base of the plant, right at where the stem meets the soil, basically. And like I said, those plants looked really good, then they got wilty and they kind of like imploded in on themselves. And this is what the base of those plants, the base of those stems look like, kind of shrunken in with this white kind of powdery. And again, we had these confirmed with Karen Rain at the Plant Diagnostic Lab that this was fusarium crown rot. I think we had some of our other growers, some of our partnering growers saw that as well. Oh, shout out, I forgot to give a shout out because she was in the last session, but she's not here. We had Emily Zobel, who's the Dorchester County ag agent. She's also has her master's degree in entomology, and she graciously came up to the Y weekly and scouted through our plots at the Y and helped some other folks kind of figure out what pest problems they were getting. Andrew and I are just, that's not our bag, so we called in an expert, and Emily did a great job of helping us identify what some of these pests and diseases were. So towards the end of the season, we did have some leaf spot on our plants, and again, some of our growers reported them as well. I don't think it ended up really affecting our plants that much. This botrytis, again, I don't think we had a lot of this, but some of our growers who planted late and harvested late, excuse me, saw this on some of our flowers. This one's particularly nasty. I mean, that's where your money is, right? Your money could potentially be in those colas, in those flowers. And so, you know, just come out to your plants and see that. I don't want anything to do with that. So, you know, that's really cutting into your potential profits there with that botrytis, which we anticipated we were going to see. Mites, I don't think we had any mites at the Y, but some of our partners did. Again, there are no products labeled for anything for hemp right now. There's some in the works through the IR4 program for next year, but right now we can't use anything. So we use some biologic control. We bought some small packets of predatory mites, and you just kind of hang them on the plants, and those predator mites eat the mites and aphids that you don't want on your plant. So we actually didn't have an issue with this, and I attribute that to our predatory mites that we used. Cucumber beetle, we had some feeding of this. Again, I don't think it did major damage to our plants. Corn earworm. So this was an interesting one. So poor Emily, we started seeing these guys later in the season, and Emily goes, have these guys been here the whole season and I've just been missing them? And this one's pretty obvious. Like, I'm not an entomologist, but I can see that worm in that flower. You know what I mean? And I said, I don't think these have been here the whole season. So we really think once the corn started getting harvested, these guys were still hungry and they just hopped over and they found our hemp plots, and you know, they said, well, this is pretty good. So again, we saw these later in the season. They didn't have really a major impact on our crops, but some of our growers, again, who planted late and harvested late, they had more of an impact from these, the corn earworm. But they weren't there the whole season. They just found us later in the season. And then finally, male plants. So I may not have mentioned this in the beginning of the talk, but when you're producing hemp for CBD, you used feminized seed or female clones, and you don't want those plants wasting time, energy, and effort on reproduction, right? You want those plants to produce flowers and focus all their energy on that. And so you have to actually cut out and cull those male plants. So we ended up having one in our quarter acre. All right, the fun or not fun stuff, depending on how you look at it. Let's talk about some of the numbers, right? All this stuff is great that I just talked about, but if you grow hemp, are you gonna make any money? Right, that's the question that we keep getting asked and that everybody cares about. All right, so the value in hemp is based on that percent CBD. That's why I showed you those graphs and talked about that percent CBD of our individual varieties. And just like any other crop, the prices vary with supply and demand. In August, before everybody harvested, the price point was up at $4. Right now, the price is under $1 per percent CBD. All right, so just like anything else, supply and demand. For these examples, we're going to use 2,000 pounds of dry mass per acre. This is probably pretty conservative. These are some of the numbers that one of our partnering growers gave us. So I will mention that we have a greenhouse grower that we're partnering with who graciously shared his numbers with us so that we could kind of present this case study. So based on his numbers, he estimated $7 to $14 to produce a pound of dry biomass. 14 is probably on the high end, but you figure if you're just getting into this, there's equipment to purchase, you got to buy your plastic, you got to buy your drip. So maybe in your second year it'll be a little closer down to 7, but we're going to stick with 14 as our conservative estimate. This gentleman also is an established greenhouse grower. He's got a crew. He estimated $14 per dry mass to harvest. So $14 to produce and then $14 to pay people, again, not mechanical, hand harvest. All right, and this particular grower is interested in processing. He estimated $15 to $20 per pound for processing. We're not talking about that. Our examples are just, you're growing this hemp and you're selling it to someone else, so we're going to be using the $14 and the $14. All right? All right, so let's take a look. We're going to pretend you're growing Bayox that has that nice 15% CBD, but we're going to use the real price, about $1. All right? So 15% CBD, $1 for each percent. So that's $15 per pound, $15,000 per 1,000 pound. We're assuming 2,000 pounds per acre, so that's revenue of $30,000 per acre. Haven't taken out your costs yet. All right? Costs, $14 per pound to produce, $14 per pound to harvest. Again, we know this is conservative. So that's $28,000 per 1,000 pounds, assuming 2,000 pounds per acre, $56,000 per acre. You're losing $26,000. That's red for a reason. Negative. This is at 15% CBD using today's price, all right, $1. All right, let's be nice. Let's say you hold on to this hemp till next year. No one's questioning your THC content. You got 15% CBD, and we're going to give you $4 for each percent CBD. $60,000 per 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds per acre. That's $120,000 per acre. Take out your $56,000 for your costs, right? 14 and 14, $28,000 per 1,000 pound, $56,000 per acre, assuming 2,000 pounds dry matter. That's the number that all the companies are telling you, right? Get rich quick. Well, that's assuming very, very specific and very good conditions. All right, so back to being the bearer of bad news, right? Next year, we've got to pay attention to that Delta 9 and the precursor. All right, both of these. So let's take a look at our plants that we grew. This is our Bayox. Remember, this one had 15% CBD when we got to October, right? The good producer. But based on this graph, again, those hash bars are our Delta 9, the solid bars are the precursor. We would have had to harvest this plant between October 13th and September 5th. Sometime in between there, we went over that legal limit of THC, right? Hopefully everyone can appreciate that from this graph. So, just as a reminder, our CBD was down between maybe about 5%. We would have had to harvest when our plant was only 5% CBD to stay below that legal limit. Okay, hang on one sec. I see your hand, 1 second. All right, let's go through those numbers again. Let's pretend we had to harvest early. We only had 5% CBD, but I'm going to be generous and I'm going to give you that $4 per percent. All right, $4 per percent CBD, $20,000 for 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds per acre. That's $40,000 per acre. You're losing money. You've got to harvest early, and I'm still giving you that high price that I don't know anyone's actually gotten to. All right, this is the real numbers. All right, real numbers, you're losing a lot of money per acre on this. Yes, sir?
Did all your growers have all the same varieties that you guys plant?
Great question. Did all of our growers have the same variety? No, we did not restrict what variety they grew. So some of them have different varieties, and I think some of our growers had this Bayox, but...
So did they do the same thing that you guys were going, checking it throughout their level?
This they did. Yeah.
So will we know if there's a variety out there that's actually going to meet for next year, even though we're...
So that's a good question. So we're all of our growers testing this, and will we know next year if there's a variety that hopefully will stay under this 0.3? Well, I think that there's a lot more than just the variety that affects this. And so there are some varieties being marketed as low THC. Oh, this one's never going to pop over. So I'm not sure. I think the recommendation moving forward is select a low THC variety and monitor it throughout the season like we did.
How long do they a grower have to work with you guys?
Great question. So we are not sure what is happening next year. The regs in Maryland were that for 2019, growers had to partner with an institution of higher education. We're not sure what's happening. We just don't know what's happening yet for 2020. We have not received guidance yet from MDA with what their plan is for moving forward.
Yeah, because it'd be interesting for them to do this and then say, hey, I got to get rid of this crop.
Right. For everyone to have to destroy their crop. Yes. Right. And as I said, this testing is expensive. I mean, this is not cheap. This is not like pulling a soil test. Everyone grumbles about pulling a soil test. Those are $8. I mean, we're looking at $50, $60 per sample. Most of our budget for this project was just paying for these samples, okay? All right, last slide. I'm almost done, I promise. How am I? Oh, I still have 2 minutes. These guys got done early. Okay, so plans for next year. Try to end on a high note. So we're going to repeat this nitrogen trial next year, just as we did this year. We're moving into the fiber game next year, all right? So after seeing all that biomass that these plants produced, I thought, wow, that biomass really should suck some phosphorus out of the soil. And those of you that knew me as a grad student just know that I can't get away from that soil phosphorus. I just can't get away from it. So we're going to grow some of this fiber hemp on some high P soils and see if all this biomass can truly pull down those soil phosphorus concentrations. And we're hopefully going to participate in a national seed and fiber variety trial so we can find which varieties are going to grow the best here. Right? We can get recommendations from the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest, but their conditions are not the same as our conditions. All right? So that's our plans for next year. Stick around, and I probably should be here next year with hopefully some more interesting data. Thank you guys. There's about a minute. I can entertain some questions, but I don't want to keep us too long because I want to keep it moving. Okay, go ahead. You first, sir. Did anybody in our trial actually sell any commercial hemp? We had some growers selling those colas, those terminal buds. We also had one grower that was doing the growing and processing themselves, and they've created a whole line of different CBD products. I don't know how much they've actually sold yet, but they are in the production process right now.
So if I were to grow 5 acres of hemp in Maryland and got started with you, I still don't have a market.
That is potentially correct. Yeah, we're not sure where the market is right now. Yes, sir.
In the old days, this stuff went into Navy rope,
Yep.
paper, clothing. Is any of that in the picture?
So I went out to Kentucky this summer and we toured a fiber processing plant. And the main takeaway that I got from that was, if we want to see this fiber hemp market take off, right? We want to grow hemp and we want to see it being used in products hopefully produced in the United States, right? What we need to do is figure out a way, and this takes engineers that are beyond my training. How do we get the hemp raw product? How do we process it to a point that it can be inserted into our currently existing industrial processes, right? Ford Motor Company is not going to change the way they produce door panels just so they can put hemp into it, right? But if we can get the hemp to a product that they can use in their manufacturing, there may be a chance for it. All right, that was the takeaway that I got from this processor in Kentucky. That, you know, the major industries are not going to change for hemp, but if we can get hemp into the pipeline for these major industries, then there's a chance for it. Great question. Thank you. All right, guys, thank you so much. I'll be around all day if you've got more questions for me.
Nicole, did you take some dry from